Original Wisdom, Stories of an Ancient Way of Knowing by Robert Wolff. Introduction. As I am preparing this collection for publication, again I think back to my childhood. I grew up in a very small town in Sumatra. My family, mother, father, and one sister, was small, but we lived among a dozen people and their families who helped us live a rich and comfortable life. Those people I thought of as my other family. During the hottest part of the day, when we were supposed to rest, I often joined them as they sat around in the shade, sharing gossip and stories. The stories were fables, I knew, but even after many retellings, they never lost their wonder. Over the years, fables became lessons and began to tell me what the world out there might be like. Even now, so many years later, when I hear the rhythm of the Malay language, I see people sitting around, leaning against a pole or against each other. Life was never hurried. I learned without being aware that I did. I still remember the time when it dawned on me that relations between humans can be very complicated and difficult, but nevertheless it was impressed upon me that humans always exist within a larger context. I knew that people, despite very great differences, were related as humans, as we are related to animals and plants around us. Now I am an elder myself. The fables I heard when I was a child have faded into the background of stories I have lived, my own stories that continue their life within me, wherever it is that stories are kept. A number of years ago, I began to write down a few of these and then put some of them together in a book, which I published in 1994. The book found its own readers. I never marketed it. Now, a new version of this collection may find its way to a larger audience. My life has spanned what must be a unique period in the long history of humankind, a period of immense changes worldwide. The human population of the world has more than doubled in the last 40 years. We have pumped more oil out of the ground after World War II than in all history before then. In the last 50 years, the millions of cars and millions of miles of roads we have built and that have become commonplace have changed the face of the planet forever. An ever-growing number of humans have access to facilities and luxuries kings would not have dreamed of even 50 years ago. Westerners, who are in the vanguard of these changes, see them as progress, an assumption rarely questioned. Perhaps because of my perspective includes memories of a kinder, gentler world, I've become acutely aware of what we have lost. In our haste to create a world entirely based on artificial, that means man-made things, we have thrown away much that is part of our heritage as creatures of this planet. By divorcing ourselves from nature, we have removed ourselves from the wisdom that comes from living as part of what is. In this age, it's not unusual anymore to visit and even live in faraway lands. We travel halfway around the earth for a week's vacation or for an assignment in a few months. Where French was the language of diplomacy, not all that long ago, English has become the language of world trade. Tourists travel to outlying lands to find the perfect beach or an exotic big city for a bargain. And yet it seems that the easier it becomes to travel, the more difficult it is to meet people in their own world. I feel blessed to have been able to meet the people who changed my life. A tribe of Aborigines in Malaysia. In some ways, they remind me of the people I knew as a child, but they are more primitive. I can easily imagine that they are a rare remnant of humans we used to be a few thousand years ago. After leaving Malaysia, where we lived for a few years, I began to read all I could find written by travelers and scientists who had known other Aboriginal people. The more I read, the more I realized that Bushmen and Pygmies in Africa and Eskimos in the high Arctic and Australian Aborigines and isolated tribes here and there around the world were described in very much the same words: peaceful, non-violent, non-aggressive. All the Aboriginal people who survived into the 20th century lived in areas of scarce resources: dense jungles, arid deserts, snow-swept ice fields. They lived in isolation, far from civilization. They were shy. They were nomadic, with few possessions, and their communities did not have elaborate hierarchies of power. And there was something else these groups had in common. They could not be tamed. To borrow a word from Lawrence Vanderpost, who used to write about the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert. I wondered what it was that affected me so deeply about the Sinoi of Malaysia. Certainly, they had a kind of integrity that I had not sensed in other people. I loved their joyfulness and their ability to be in the present, their utter simplicity. When I was with them, I was moved by the strange synchronicities, C.G. Jung's term, that so often occurred. How was it possible that people without a telephone knew that I was coming to visit, when I did not know myself until just a few hours before I left home? How could one person know what another was thinking and feeling and dreaming? But perhaps more than anything else, with the Sinoi, I basked in a kind of unconditional love that is rare in Western societies and in societies that have become westernized. I now know that I could find them only if they wanted to be found. They trusted me. My love for people who experienced reality directly rather than through layers of learned concepts of what the world should be allowed me to rediscover a reality of my own that is as immediate and intimate as the world of the Sinoi. I recognized that I had hidden this reality deep inside myself. I had always known that the world and I were inseparably one, but had suppressed that knowing, buried it under words and theories. My friends, Sinoi, and others of these stories helped me regain the reality that of being part of all that is. Westerners are intolerant of other ways to organize society, other ways to be human. We cannot accept that others may value different ways of being. We seem to be stuck in the idea that all people must want what we have and what we value, all those things that we believe prove that Western civilization is the pinnacle of human achievement, the best, the future. Science is so sure that it is the only truth that it has become incapable of accepting other ways of learning about reality. Medicine, as a scientific discipline, for instance, is certain that all other forms of healing are quackery and are not to be tolerated. They must be rooted out and destroyed. Such arrogant insistence has eradicated much knowledge and wisdom in the world. I always knew that there were other, older ways of healing. For many years, my work took me to many parts of the Southeast Asia and the Pacific. I recorded and collected what I could of methods of healing and herbal medicines. I became obsessed with the thought that I ran a race with time, that soon it would be too late because no one would remember ancient traditions. It seemed that all such knowledge was being erased by our intolerance of otherness. I was deeply saddened by what I believed was an irreparable loss. In our rush to create man-made chemicals, we rejected age-old knowledge of the riches of the earth that are freely available all around us. We invented machines, but ignored talents and abilities we must have in our very genes. My agony over what I thought of as great loss stayed with me until One day, when I was in Tonga, an island kingdom in the South Pacific. Tonga is one of the very few countries that have escaped colonization, although not the overlay of a Western religion. I mentioned my despair over what we had lost to a woman who had been pointed out to me as a gifted native healer. So much knowledge and wisdom, I said, was lost through our crude but persistent effort to eradicate native cultures. She thought about that for a long time. Finally, she said, "Yes, I know what you mean. Yes, we too used to have healers and much knowledge of healing and herbs. Most of that is gone." She paused again for at least a minute. Then she sat up straight and looked me in the eye, her voice becoming stronger and more affirmative. "But," and she pointed her finger for emphasis, "that is not the whole of it. You see, there have always been people who know. When we most need it, someone will remember that ancient knowledge." She sat back smiling. "So you see, traditions may be lost, but the information is here. In here," she said, pointing to her head and then her heart. "And when we need it most, it will be inside us for us to find." She was referring to herself, I knew. Her gift of healing did not come from a Western education, nor did it come from training in traditional healing. It came from within. I must believe what she said is true. I have experienced that knowing. There were times when I needed knowledge of the plants around me, and it came to me. Instinctively, I knew where to find the knowledge. Now we would say information I needed. The same is true in other areas of skill and experience. The ancient art of building canoes may have been lost, but when I was a passenger traveling on the open ocean in a 14-foot Boston whaler for 12 hours with no land in sight, the sailors who manned the vessel remembered again how to find their way by stars at night, and during the day by currents, and on the little winds, as some Polynesians say. It is true that what remains of old tradition is no longer a coherent system of knowledge and skills. Yet individuals everywhere are recovering and recreating what their forebears had. There are kahuna, priests. Again, in Hawaii, a century ago, missionaries did what they could to eradicate all remnants of heathenism, but somehow enough ancient knowledge survived. I knew a modern-day kahuna well. He considered himself a kahuna lapa'au, a healing priest. He agreed that what he knew did not always come to him in a straight line, from father to son, from teacher to pupil, but rather from his own knowing, from inside himself. Others have said the same. Perhaps, despite great destruction of human experience, ancient insight and wisdom are not lost. Somehow they are still part of us, inside us. These insights can and will come back to us when we need them. As a child listening to the people who were near and dear to me, I never thought that one way of looking at the world was better than another. When I returned to that part of the world as an adult, I realized that our arrogant attitude towards other ways of being caused great pain and eventually the destruction of almost all indigenous cultures in these latter years. That was brought home to me most searingly when I visited a small island in the Pacific with a few coworkers. I had no part in the job in public health people had to do that day, so I asked one of the local people to show me around the island. I told him I was particularly interested in learning about what I called native medicine. When he seemed doubtful, I explained that, obviously, people who had lived on a small island far away from other islands must have developed a way to heal wounds. Certainly, they must know how to assist in childbirth, perhaps even know ways to set a broken bone. "Oh, that," he said. "Yes, there are some people who know." We walked around the island. He introduced me to a woman who knew herbs and her two sisters who were midwives. I met a man who knew much in the many different kinds of seaweed and which could be used medicinally, and several people who had other healing skills. I took copious notes, although I soon discovered that people were not happy when I made notes in their presence. So between visits, my guide and I would sit on a rock somewhere, and I would write in my notebook. We talked. It was afternoon when we came back to where the boat waited for us to take my friends and myself back to the main island, and to take me back to the airport. The island did not have a harbor or much of a beach, so we had to be ferried to the boat in local canoes. I was in the last canoe. Just as we were about to manhandle the canoe into the water, my guide of the day rushed up with a gift. He wanted to thank me, he said breathlessly. You are the first, and white man in parentheses, who said some things we have is worth. His words made an indelible impression on me. I realized that what he said was probably true. Other white men may have visited his island, but nobody had ever taken the trouble to ask them about their lives, their practices, their beliefs, their knowledge, because we are so sure that whatever indigenous people have is not worth knowing. The stories in this book are true in the sense that I have lived them. I share them to honor the worth and wisdom of the many people I came to know all over the world. Assumptions. My first career position was government psychologist in Suriname, a developing country in South America. I had worked before, of course, but this, I thought, would be the first step on my career ladder. Little did I know that this ladder not only went up, but it also went around the world. While we were in Suriname, Life magazine photographed the jungles around Paramaribo, a capital city for what later became the issue on the tropical rainforest in the series, The World We Live In. The country lies a few degrees above the equator. It is hot and humid and densely forested. Then there were very few roads. One traveled on the rivers in steamboats or dugout canoes. Suriname had been a colony first of England and then of Holland, and now had a new sort of independence. The original population was native Caribbean American. They call themselves Arawak. They were displaced by African slaves a few hundred years ago. Because of the dense jungle, a majority of slaves escaped almost immediately and were never captured. Instead, these slaves who liberated themselves established a 17th century African culture in the interior of Suriname. 100 years ago, they made peace with the government of the Netherlands. The Juka, as they called themselves then, controlled the interior. The Dutch ruled a narrow strip along the coast, with the capital, Paramaribo, and a few other small towns. Today, Suriname is independent. The colonists were certain that they were unable to work in that climate. And they were probably right. They wore too many clothes for a tropical jungle, but they also thought themselves vastly superior to the people who did not have their kind of civilization. So workers had to come from elsewhere. After the abolition of slavery, people from South Asia, now known India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and later from Java, could be talked into signing contracts as indentured laborers. Although the contracts guaranteed that they would be returned home after their term was served, many chose to stay. In Suriname, all people mix indiscriminately. The palette of skin colors there is unique in the world. There may be few African blacks, also called blue blacks, but there's every other shade of black, brown, beige, yellow, and almost white. Suriname has aluminum ore that is mined by Alcoa, the United States Aluminum Company. Some people worked for Alcoa, a few people grew food, and a few even found gold nuggets in the jungle and smuggled them to Miami. But there was not much of anything people could do to make a living except work for the government, the largest employer in the country at that time. Soon, very soon after we arrived, I heard that some of the department heads and other bosses felt that workers were lazy and unambitious. That surprised me because people I had befriended seemed happy, active men and women, always ready to improve themselves. Since there was no institution of higher learning in the country, they wrote away for correspondence courses. It was only later that I learned that my friends often took courses that had little or nothing to do with their work, but the students felt that they were improving themselves, not their work skills. They desperately wanted to learn and found learning everywhere they could. After I was hired, I was asked, "What does a psychologist do?" I had 2 degrees in psychology, one of them brand new, untested degree in social psychology from a famous American university. I thought I knew survey technology. I was supposed to know how to conduct, analyze, and interpret an attitude survey. So when I was asked what a psychologist does, I explained attitude surveys, sampling, research in general, and the importance of validity and reliability, none of which was an answer to the question, of course. Then I said that a psychologist finds out what people are really like, not what other people think they are like. Undoubtedly, I explained too much. I got no reaction. I thought the subject closed. In fact, I almost forgot about it. Someone knew, however, that psychologists also administer tests. I was put to work testing children in a newly established child clinic. My first official action had to be telling my superior that we could not use any of the tests he had ordered because the tests were designed for Western educated children. Local children spoke a different language and had a very different culture and could not be expected to be within the norms developed elsewhere. We invented other tests and we managed. About a year later, when I'd almost forgotten my earlier conversation about what a psychologist does, a notice in the local paper screamed, "The government hereby announces that the government psychologist will conduct a scientific study to find out why people are so lazy. All people are notified that they must cooperate." I protested. I tried to make my superiors understand that under the circumstances, I could not do a valid study. They agreed to wait 6 months while I carefully and secretly designed a survey and hoped people would forget about the notice in the newspaper. Our survey would ask a sample of government employees questions about their attitudes towards work. When we did a trial run, we discovered that few people had ever taken a multiple choice test, so our trial run failed miserably. I revised my ideas and designed a new interview study. We changed the questions somewhat and trained interviewers. Through this, we discovered that it is not the format after all, but the questions that were wrong. Too many people could not answer the questions our interviewers asked. For instance, after a section in which the interviewers asked employees what their jobs were, by jobs we meant careers, we asked, "If you were not doing what you are doing now, what would you prefer to do?" A common enough question in the West, which I expected would lead people to express their satisfaction with their job and perhaps their motivation and ambition. Instead, I was met with blank stares. In our question, they responded, "What I am doing now." They asked, "What else would we be doing?" Yes, definitely what they were doing now. At the children's clinic, meanwhile, I had been trying to use a test that was commonly used in Europe and America at that time. I would give the children a piece of paper and some colored crayons and ask them to draw something, anything. To my astonishment, of the children who were given the test, 263 at first, only 2 produced anything at all. The rest sat with dead faces. Ages varied, but all of the children were primary school age. Their average age was 8.5. The draw something anything test had been discussed extensively in psychology books and journals. There were established norms to interpret the work that children would produce. The test was considered to be a cross-cultural. It could be used in any culture without bias, the experts said. And yet, here was a population where children between the ages of 6 and 10 did not produce anything that could be analyzed. I thought of several explanations. Perhaps paper and pencil were strange to them. I was wrong about that. Or I thought they were scared of me because I'm white. I got along with the children well enough and had never sensed any fear in them, but in a country of people of all imaginable colors, few were as white as I am. I asked a native teacher to help me administer the test. She asked the children to draw something, anything. Same result. Blank stares. When my family and I made friends, we were struck by the many possible configurations of families. They were only sometimes made up of a father, mother, and children, and were much more likely to be something else. We knew a mother with 12 children who had varying arrangements, at least with 4 of the fathers of the children. While these men were not live-in parents, they were considered family, and they regularly visited at the mother's large home. Another family we knew occupied 3 adjacent houses. There were 3 grandmothers, 2 grandfathers, fathers, mothers, countless aunts, uncles, a colorful and powerful grand-aunt, nieces and nephews, cousins, and of course, many children. I never learned who the head of that family was, but as we got to know them, it seemed as if there were several separate webs of relationships and decision-making that were hard to comprehend. The young woman who managed the money in the family became a special friend of ours. When we asked her how many people were in her family, she threw up her hands and said, "I never know from one day to the next. People come and go." Few people in Suriname were rich because in part it is almost impossible to become rich when the money that is coming in is shared by such large extended families. Yet nobody in that large group went hungry. All of these different kinds of families seem to have in common that they wished fervently for their children to improve themselves. Improving yourself did not mean learning a particular skill, but becoming more knowledgeable in general, becoming perhaps more cultured. But I'm getting ahead of my story. I did not fully realize the importance the families attached to improving oneself until after the results of the survey. The survey was barely limping along when a man came to see me. Although uneducated, he was obviously intelligent and insightful. He said that because he thought I liked the country's people, he wanted to help me. "It is very simple," he said. "People here have not had much choice about anything. We do not think in terms of what we would rather be doing. When a boy reaches the age when it is thought that he'd better do something to stay out of trouble, the first job that comes along is what he does. When it is time for him to get a woman, the first woman that comes along who is willing is his woman. Very simple indeed." Immediately, I made the obvious connection with the draw something, anything test. What would happen, I wondered, if I asked the children to draw a house, or their mother, or themselves? They all drew with gusto and no little skill. All along, it was not that they could not draw. What blocked them was my instruction to draw something, anything. They needed to be told what to draw. The children had no difficulty expressing themselves, imagining, creating, but they had never been given that much choice, that much freedom. I discussed this with the teachers and others. Yes, they all agreed. The culture, the way people had been living, did not allow many choices, so that such an open-ended question to draw something, anything, might well be meaningless to children, perhaps even frightening. I can choose between carrots and tomatoes if both vegetables are on a dish in front of me. But when there is only one vegetable, and from past experience I know that that is all there is, it would be foolish for me to say that I would rather have. I take what is offered. Now I understand the stares we received when we asked some of the questions on the survey. They had never been asked these kinds of questions before. People had never thought about what they would rather do. They did whatever work there was. because choosing was not something people had much practice with. Choosing an imaginary alternative was simply not in their experience. The survey became a much larger project than I had foreseen. I had to reconsider questions that would have been routine if we had done this survey in a Western country. This was not a Western country, however. We could no longer ask people what they would rather do. Instead, we read them little stories with the idea that by identifying with the people in the story, they could tell us what they thought the people in the story would choose. After doing some trial tests, that seemed to work well enough. In the end, when we had rewritten the questions several times, when we thought we had good, reliable information, when we analyzed all the information forward and backward, I found that it was the questions I had asked myself that were wrong. I had made assumptions about human behavior that might have made sense in a Western society, but they made no sense in Suriname at this time. Of course, Surinamers were not lazy, far from it. They sacrificed their own time and money to take correspondence courses. True, the courses they took often had no bearing on their jobs, but acquiring new or better job skills was not why they took them. I had assumed that workers thought as Westerners do. The better you do at a job, the more income you get. Therefore, it is to your advantage to learn things that help you do a better job. I assumed that it was how people everywhere thought about work. These assumptions are so basic in our society that we are not even aware that we hold them. In Suriname at the time, however, your worth is not determined by what you did or how well you did it, but by you becoming a better person. Most families we knew wanted the children to become better people. They had not learned that in a Western world it does not pay to acquire a general education, but it is important to have better training for a specific job. Someone told me, "It is not so much that you have training, skill, or even money that determines your worth, but who you are, a good person." In tribal societies, one's worth comes from the tribe one belongs to, not from individual skills or competence. In Suriname, government employees knew, of course, that they no longer lived in a tribal society, but they felt that they now belonged to the government, and they were proud to belong to the government, which they called Papa Governman. It was a prestigious tribe to belong to, and to show their pride as well as their appreciation, they took correspondence courses to better themselves. You did your tribe proud by becoming a better person. It did not occur to people that an employer might not care whether you were a better person. The employer was interested in hiring better qualified employees, or a better educated employee, or a more ambitious employee who might acquire new job-related skills. The expectations of employer and employee were very different. Employers grumbled because employees were lazy, they said, or unambitious. But the behavior they judged lazy or unambitious was rooted in tribal thinking. Employers thought as Westerners think. Employers lived in one reality, the reality of the West. Employees lived in a very different reality, the reality of a tribal people. Some years later, I met a very sophisticated university professor from Suriname's neighboring country, Ghana. He was bitter and quite outspoken about what he called the colonial experience. There, the colonists, whose whole culture is designed to imprint on us, the colonized, that they are better than we are. They tell us that we must strive to become like them, lords and ladies. But we cannot become lords and ladies. We shall always be less. He spoke impeccable, immaculate BBC English. If you had not seen his dark brown skin, you certainly might have thought him Lord something or other. Surinamers perhaps felt less as well, and perhaps believed that improving themselves would buy entry into the civilized world. I learned that I cannot make assumptions about what drives people, nor can I make generalizations about what people are really like until I can stand in their shoes, so to speak. My apologies to the blank-faced children whom I asked to draw something, anything. They had not learned to choose. They never had to choose. there had been few possibilities or choices in their lives.